The wagon had left Rosby before dawn. It was a common enough run: 6 crates of salted pork, 2 barrels of rye flour, a crate of dried figs, wrapped in cloth that the merchant had spent 3 days arguing over the price of. The driver was a man named Edwick, who had done this route 41 times and had strong opinions about which stretch of road turned to mud first after rain. His assistant was a boy of 14, whose name nobody would later remember, because the boy would not be the one to reach the city gates alive. The King's Road south of King's Landing was never entirely safe. Everyone knew this. Edwick knew this. He carried a short knife under the seat and a length of chain beside it, and he had learned over the years that the best approach to trouble on the road was to give it something small before it took something large. A cask of the cheaper flour, a handful of coppers, the figs if the men were patient enough to negotiate. There were 7 of them, waiting at the bend where the willows grew close to the road. Edwick saw the blocking timber across the ruts and pulled the horse to a stop without being asked. He had seen this before. What he had not seen before was the woman standing slightly apart from the rest at the edge of the tree line, watching. She was not hiding. She stood with the particular stillness of someone who had no reason to. Tall, pale, with hair the color of a winter sky pulled back from a face that showed no urgency whatsoever. Her clothing was dark and fitted close-cut with a precision that had nothing to do with the road or the forest or the kind of life that ended up at a bend in the King's Road at dawn. It had the look of rank about it, of order. Not a merchant's coat, not a traveler's cloak, something with structure to it, something that belonged on a person who gave commands and expected them to be carried out without repetition. The collar sat high against her neck. Her boots reached the knee. Whatever she was, she had not dressed for hiding. The other 7 were loud in the way that men are loud when they need the noise to do work. Their courage cannot. She was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with patience. Edwick's first thought was that she was with them. His second thought, which arrived almost immediately after, was that this was wrong and that he could not explain why he was so certain of it. The leader of the group, a broad man with a badly healed nose and a sword worn on the wrong hip, told Edwick to get down from the wagon. Edwick was already calculating which of the crates he could afford to surrender when he noticed that the woman at the tree line had not moved, but the temperature around him had dropped. Not gradually, not the slow cooling of a cloud crossing the sun. It dropped the way a stone drops. The leader noticed it too. He stopped speaking mid-sentence and stared down at his boots. The ground around him had gone white. It spread from beneath the woman's feet outward across the mud, and dead leaves crackling softly as it moved. The frost climbing the roots of the willows and coating the blocking timber in a skin of ice that caught what little morning light had broken through the overcast. The 7 men began to back away. Then they stopped backing away. Several of them had stopped moving entirely. Their boots sealed to the earth in the space of 4 heartbeats. The ice climbing past their ankles with a sound like slow, splintering wood. The woman walked forward. She did not hurry. She moved through the clearing the way a person moves through a room they own, her attention settling on each man, in turn with the same unhurried assessment. The way a hunter marks which animal to take first, which to leave. She said nothing. Nobody said anything. The broad man with the badly healed nose opened his mouth once, and then closed it, and Edwick would remember this detail for years afterward. Not the man's fear, but the specific quality of it. Not panic, not pleading. Something rawer than either the look of a man who had just understood in his body before his mind caught up that he was in the presence of something that did not operate by any rule he had ever learned. The boy beside Edwick buried his face against Edwick's arm and did not watch. Edwick watched. He could not say how long it lasted. His memory of the next several minutes had the fractured quality of recalled dreams. Images present, but sequence scrambled cause and effect, upended by a mind that had no framework for what it was receiving. He remembered sound. A sharp crack repeated the way ice behaves when pressure builds inside it too quickly. He remembered the leader's face at the moment the woman reached him. The mouth still half open, the eyes still trying to make sense of it. And then the crack again louder, and the face was no longer doing anything at all. He remembered one of the other men wrenching sideways hard enough to tear free of his own boot, stumbling 3 steps into the tree line before the frost found him there, too, mid-stride, one arm raised as though to ward something off. The arm stayed raised. Nothing moved after that. When Edwig's attention came back to the road, the woman was already walking away. She did not glance at the wagon. She did not acknowledge him. She walked back toward the tree line, with her hands loose at her sides, and the clearing behind her was still and white and deeply, completely silent in the way that places fall silent after something living has been taken out of them all at once. The 7 men were still there. The shapes of them were. Edwig got the wagon moving. He did not stop at the bodies to check for signs of life. His hands were shaking badly enough that he dropped the reins twice before his grip held, and the horse, which had been tossing its head and pulling hard since the temperature dropped, settled only gradually as the frozen section of road receded behind them. The boy said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Was that a witch?" Edwig did not answer, because he was not sure the word was wrong, and he was not sure it was right either. And he had found in his years on the road that when both of those things were true at once, it was better to say nothing at all and let the road carry you forward. They reached the city gates 2 hours later. The morning watch had changed over, and the guards on duty were mid-argument about something involving dice, which they dropped the moment they saw Edwig's face. He told them what had happened in the order. It had happened, which was not the same as the order that made sense, and they listened without interrupting. One went inside to find a captain. Another came around the wagon to look at Edwig's hands, which had stopped shaking but were still blanched across the knuckles. The captain who came out was a man named Hyle, a veteran of the city watch, thick through the shoulders, with the permanent half-squint of a man who had spent too many years being told things he did not want to believe. He ran through the questions in the practice sequence, how many in the group, what weapons they carried, whether the woman was traveling with others or alone, what she looked like. Edwig told him. Tall, light hair, dressed like a soldier or something close to it. Calm in a way that made calm feel like the wrong word. Hyle wrote it down without expression. "The bodies," he said. "Describe the bodies." Edwig described them. Hyle's pen stopped moving. "Frozen," he said. "Yes. It is the 9th month." He set the pen down. "The temperature this morning." "I know what month it is," Edwig said flatly. Hyle held his gaze for a long moment, then shifted his attention to the boy, who had not spoken since the witch question, and was currently studying the stones of the gatehouse floor with the fixed concentration of someone who had decided very deliberately to stop thinking about certain things. Hyle looked at the boy's face. Then he picked the pen back up. He made 2 more entries in the ledger, folded it shut, and told Edwig to stay inside the gate and available for further questioning. Then he pulled 2 men aside and sent them north up the King's Road to the Bend, with the willows, with instructions to bring back a complete account of what they found. The number of bodies, their condition, and the precise state of the surrounding ground. They rode out. They came back 3 hours later. Hyle read the account standing in the gatehouse doorway. Read it through once, turned it over, and read the notation on the back, where one of his men had added a line separately from the main report, as though he had not wanted it mixed in with the rest. Hyle read that line twice. Then he folded the pages, went inside, and drafted a message to the Red Keep. He was not certain what had happened. He was certain of something else. In 22 years of city watch work, he had learned to sort strangeness by type. Some of it resolved when you pushed on it, drunk witnesses, exaggerated accounts, tricks of light or fear. Some of it did not resolve. Some of it got worse the more you examined it. He sealed the message and handed it to a runner without another word. The runner reached the Red Keep before midday. A steward in Lannister colors broke the seal, and the lower offices read the contents through once, and then set it aside and read 2 other documents before coming back to it and reading it again. He was a careful man, not given to overreaction, and he spent several minutes deciding what category this fell into, before attaching his own brief note witness account, consistent physical evidence, confirmed by second party, and passing it up the chain to the office that handled reports of unusual incidents within the city's outer radius. By evening, it sat on a desk in the lower levels of the Red Keep, somewhere between a record of a boundary dispute in Flea Bottom and a complaint from a minor lord about tariffs. Unremarkable in its placement. Not unremarkable in its contents. Outside the walls, the King's Road curved south through the willows. The ice on the lower branches had not melted. The bodies had been removed eventually, though the 2 men sent to do it had worked in near silence and returned to the gatehouse with the clipped, flattened expressions of people who had touched something they could not account for and were not planning to discuss it further. The frost remained on the ground at the bend long after everything else in the clearing had returned to the ordinary mud of late autumn. Not thick, not dramatic. Just a pale trace along the roots and the wheel ruts, precise and clean. Like a signature left by someone who had no need to announce their name. No one had seen which direction she went. No one had thought to look. The story reached the docks before it reached the castle. That was how it always worked. The Red Keep sat on its hill and believed itself the first to know everything. But news moved fastest at ground level through fishmongers and draymen, through the women who washed the City Watch's uniforms, through boys who ran errands between brothels and counting houses, and collected in the process far more than anyone meant to give them. By the time Captain Hyle's dispatch had been copied, sealed, delivered, set aside, and routed to the appropriate office in the lower levels of the keep, the story of the woman at the Willow Bend had already fractured into 4 accounts and was breeding a 5th. At the docks, they were calling her a sorceress from Essos. The logic was simple: strange power, cold origin, no name. Essos absorbed everything King's Landing could not categorize. A sailor 3 cups into his morning told anyone nearby that he had witnessed something similar once in Karth, a woman who could stop a man's heart with a look, which was not the same thing at all, but close enough for a crowd with no investment in precision. In the Flea Bottom market, the account had gone local. A disgraced noblewoman from somewhere above the neck. A cousin of someone's neighbor had it, who had bargained with something old, and was now drifting south seeking either shelter or vengeance, depending on the teller's mood. The 7 dead had swelled to 10. The bend in the road had become a hamlet. The pale hair had become white, which felt more appropriate to the story's needs. In the barracks nearest the Gate of the Gods, where Hyle's men drank alongside 3 other watches, the telling was shorter and worse. 7 bodies. Genuine ice on a warm morning. 2 riders sent to confirm back within hours with the kind of faces men get when they have touched something they cannot fit into any category they own. That account did not get stretched or colored. The men who told it did so quietly and then sat with their cups without elaborating. That version was the one that mattered. Varys received word before the afternoon watch. Not directly, he never received anything directly, which suited him. What arrived was a condensed account passed through 3 intermediaries, delivered to the small upper room he kept for exactly this purpose, written in the compressed hand of someone practiced at keeping their name off interesting pages. He read it twice, then set it on the table and pressed 1 finger against the paper. 7 men, 9th month. No mechanism consistent with known causes. The City Watch had filed a dispatch. Hyle had sent it up. That meant official channels were carrying it, which meant Cersei's household would intercept a copy before long. The question was not whether it reached the Queen. The question was what shape it would be in when it did, and whether she would move before he understood what he was looking at. He turned the fact that stayed with him over in his mind. She had taken nothing. Not a coin from the bodies. Not the horse. Not the wagon sitting 20 feet away with its cargo intact. Power of various kinds surfaced in the world regularly enough that Varys had long since stopped being startled by it. What drew his attention here was the absence of transaction. 7 men dead and nothing collected. That was either indifference to material gain, which implied she already had what she needed, or something more deliberate. An action done for its own sake or for what it communicated. He sent 2 of his little birds toward the King's Road and 1 to the harbor master's quarter, where ship manifests recorded who arrived by sea and from where. Then he waited, which cost him nothing and revealed a great deal. The second incident came that same afternoon 2 miles east. A grain depot operated by a minor merchant house occupied the junction of 2 roads feeding into the city from the Crownlands. 4 contracted men-at-arms held the post. Their function was deterring theft, which had grown common since the war stripped the roads of regular patrols. They were found at their stations, upright, eyes open, mouths shut. The expressions on their faces were not fear. They were nothing in particular the faces of men caught between one task and the next, which was somehow considerably worse. The ground around the entrance lay under ice in a circle of roughly 30 feet thick enough to have cracked one of the gate's lower hinges. The fence post, the iron tying ring, the threshold itself all sealed. The pattern was not random. The ice was heaviest at the 4 positions where the guards had stood, as though whatever had moved through the space had known exactly where the watch points were, and found them worth marking. The foreman had been inside. He heard nothing, which he said twice when questioned, and then did not say again. He came out when the hinge cracked, saw what was there, went back in, and stayed until a patrol happened past. The patrol sent word to the nearest outpost. The outpost sent word to Hyle. Hyle set the new message beside the morning's documentation and stared at both for a long time. He had spent 22 years learning to distinguish between incidents that looked connected and incidents that were. He ran through the differences between what he knew and what he was assuming, which was a habit drilled into him early and maintained through a career's worth of reports that turned out to be exaggerated. These were not exaggerated. Same day, same radius, same method. No robbery at either scene. No witnesses to arrival or departure at either location. And now at the second sight ice that had arranged itself with a precision that wind and temperature did not produce. He picked up his pen, set it down, and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. "Hells," he said quietly to no one. Then he picked the pen back up and wrote the second dispatch to the Red Keep, flagged with the notation he used for situations that had stopped being isolated. Events pattern, suspected, confirmation, recommended, expedient response, advised. He had used that notation 4 times in 22 years. Twice it had dissolved into nothing. Once it had unraveled a smuggling network. Once it had gotten a man to shelter before someone cut his throat. He sealed it without reading it back and called for a runner. Both dispatches arrived at the Red Keep within the same hour and landed by the kind of administrative accident that is less accident than the work of an organized filing system on the same desk. The desk belonged to Alvin, an undersecretary in the household office, 11 years in the position, 60 documents processed on an average day. He was selected for the role, partly because he did not alarm easily, which made him useful in an office that received alarming information constantly, and needed someone capable of sorting the genuine from the inflated. He read both documents, set them aside, worked through 14 others, came back. The phrase that appeared in both in different handwriting and from different sources No conventional explanation consistent with observed evidence. He sat with that for a moment. Then he did something he had done twice in 11 years. He bypassed the standard routing chain entirely and carried both pages personally to the antechamber outside the Tower of the Hand, where Tyrion Lannister's secretary received materials the Hand wanted before the rest of the castle had settled on an interpretation. He told the secretary only what was necessary. Unidentified individual, 2 confirmed incidents in a single day. Methods outside anything the City Watch had standing orders to address. Walking back to his desk, Alvin folded his handwritten notes from both documents and put them in the inner pocket of his coat. Against procedure. He did it anyway. In 11 years, he had developed a reliable instinct for which documents were going to become very significant very quickly, and for how thoroughly the official record of such documents tended to shift once people with larger interests started handling them. He wanted to remember what the originals actually said. Varys's birds came back at nightfall with nothing from the harbor masters. No pale-haired woman traveling alone. No manifest entry matching the description. No captain who recalled such a passenger in the last month. She had not come by sea. He stood at the window and considered what that left. His network covered the major road approaches well and the minor ones adequately. A person moving through the Crown Lands without appearing in any record he controlled was either extraordinarily careful about avoiding attention or simply indifferent to the attention she attracted, which implied she had no reason to fear what the attention might bring. He sent a final note that evening to a woman who ran a tavern near the Gate of the Gods and maintained as a secondary occupation careful records of strangers who asked particular kinds of questions about the city. He asked her to extend her scope. No specific description yet, just wider. Then he went to bed, which he did not do because he was tired, but because he had learned that a great deal of useful thinking happened in the interval between deciding something and acting on it, and that interval required rest. The walls had not stopped her. He was becoming increasingly confident they would not. In the barracks, near the Gate of the Gods, one of the men who had moved the bodies from the willow bend that morning sat awake well past the change of watch. He had no particular trouble with sleep under ordinary circumstances. He had come through the war intact, seen enough of what men did to each other, that the images did not follow him home the way they followed some. He kept thinking about the arm. The man caught mid-stride in the tree line, one arm raised as though to push something away, frozen at the exact moment between deciding to run and running. The ice coating it was seamless. No layers, no grain, no sign of gradual accumulation. It had the character of something that had happened all at once, instantaneously, which was not a character that ice possessed. He had touched it. His job required it. The cold had passed through the leather of his glove, as though the glove were cloth, as though his hand were bare, as though the cold were not a temperature but a decision. He sat with his untouched cup and listened to the barracks breathe around him and did not sleep. Outside the walls, the night ran on. Cool for the season, strangely so, though no one connected it to anything. The roads were quiet. The tree lines were dark. Somewhere in the space between the city and the horizon, something moved or did not move. No one could say with certainty, because no one who had seen her had managed to track where she went afterward. In the morning, Tyrion Lannister would read 2 dispatches and ask a question that no one else in the Red Keep had thought to ask. Not where she was. Not what she wanted. Something sharper than either. But that was morning. Tonight the city took what it had been given and did what cities do, folded it into gossip and ledger entries and the fitful dreams of men who had touched things they could not name, pressing it down into its own layers, where most things eventually lost their shape. A few things did not. Tyrion read the first account in 4 minutes. He read the second in 3. Then he set both on the table, poured himself a cup of wine he did not drink, and sat looking at the space between them. His secretary, Biren, waited near the door. The young man had learned over 2 years of working for the Hand that there were different kinds of silence in this office, and that most of them were not invitations to fill. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched the floor. Tyrion picked up the first page again. 7 men, 9th month. Ice in open country. No weather caused no prior event. Witness account internally consistent, corroborated by physical evidence on the scene. He set it down and picked up the second. 4 guards. Same day. 2 miles east. Ice in a circle of 30 feet heaviest at the 4 watch positions. No theft. No witness to arrival or departure. He put that one down too. Byron. My lord. If someone wanted to avoid detection, what would they do? Byron hesitated not long, but enough. Move at night. Stay off the main roads. Avoid places with people. And if they did none of those things, a beat. Then they either haven't noticed they're being watched, or they don't care. Or, Tyrion said, they want to be watched. They want to choose who does the watching. He turned the first page over and studied the back where nothing was written. 7 dead on a public road. A wagon driver left alive. 2 events in a single day, both within range of the city's patrol routes, both discovered and reported within hours. He finally reached for his cup. She is not hiding. She is not running. She is waiting to see who comes looking, and I suspect how they come. Byron's mouth opened slightly, then closed. After a moment, he said, "That's a strange thing to want." "It is," Tyrion agreed, "which is exactly why it interests me." He drained the cup. "Send word to Varys. Tell him I have 2 pages and a question, and that the question will interest him. Don't be polite about it. He'll arrive faster if he thinks I've already worked something out." "And the Queen?" Tyrion looked at the pages once more. "The Queen will have a summary through her household channels before midday. I would rather have spoken with Varys first." He stood slowly, closed the door. Turned. Varys arrived before the second bell. He settled into the chair across from Tyrion with the ease of a man who had long ago concluded that appearing to hurry anywhere was a form of admission. He accepted the documents, read them in the order presented, and handed them back without comment. Tyrion waited. "She took nothing," Varys said. "That's the part I keep returning to. It suggests she has no material need, or that material gain isn't what the exercise is for." Varys turned one palm upward, a small gesture. "My people found no record of her arriving by sea. No ship's manifest, no harbor entry. The road records are less reliable, but nothing there either." A pause. "She arrived through a gap I haven't located, which tells me something. That she's careful. That she came from somewhere my network doesn't cover." He let the weight of that settle. "I find the second possibility considerably more unsettling than the first." Tyrion leaned back. "Here is where I land. She left a wagon driver alive at the first scene, a foreman alive at the second inside the building. Near enough to hear the gate hinge crack, but untouched. She could have killed both. She didn't." He turned the cup in his hands. "Either she has a reason to leave witnesses, or she draws a line at killing men who aren't armed. Either way, that's not random. That's a choice being made consistently." "Discipline," Varys said. "Discipline with a purpose." And Tyrion set the cup down. "What I can answer is what the purpose is. She's been in the Crown Lands at least a day. Possibly longer. She hasn't moved toward the city. She hasn't moved away. She's operating close enough to guarantee the Watch hears about it, but she hasn't touched the walls. He looked at Varys. You and I are reading the same pattern, but I'm not certain we're reading the same reason for it. Varys tilted his head. You think she's watching the response? I think that's one possibility. Another is that she simply doesn't consider our response worth accounting for, that this is how she moves through any place, and our reaction is irrelevant to her. He paused. I am not sure which of those I find more uncomfortable. Varys was quiet for a moment. The Queen received a summary of the first matter this morning. She hasn't seen the second account yet. How long before she acts on what she has? Before she acts on incomplete information in a direction I can't predict, less time than I'd like. Tyrion stood and crossed to the window. The city spread below in its usual arrangement of noise and density. The harbor's gray water, the smoke from the street of steel, the red roofs packed together in the lower wards. Somewhere beyond those walls, a woman had killed 11 men in a day and left the wagons and the horses and every coin on every body untouched. We need to reach her before soldiers do, he said. Soldiers will communicate exactly the wrong thing. Agreed. And before Littlefinger decides she's an angle. He's already decided, Varys said with the mild tone he used for things that were unfortunate but not surprising. He hasn't moved yet. He's still pricing the approach. Motionless. Then we have a day, perhaps less. Tyrion turned from the window. I want someone sent out this afternoon. 2 or 3 people, not a squad. Led by someone with the sense to speak before drawing steel. He looked at Varys. Someone she won't decide to deal with the same way she dealt with the men at the road. I have someone in mind. Good. The instructions are simple. Don't threaten her. Don't offer gold. Don't test what she can do. Make contact. Tell her the Hand of the King would like to speak with her at her convenience. Wherever she chooses. He handed both pages to Byron, who had reappeared in the doorway at the right moment, which Tyrion noticed and filed away as a sign the young man was paying closer attention than he let on. File these under seal, not through the standard routing. Varys rose from the chair. And the Queen's people, keep them looking at something else for the afternoon. Easily done. Runt. He moved toward this door, then paused. You expect her to accept. I expect her to be curious that someone sent an invitation instead of a column of spears. Tyrion looked back at the window. Curiosity is something I can work with. Everything else about her, I'm less certain of. Jack, Cersei heard about the second event before midday. She read the summary standing, which was how she received information she didn't yet know how to use. Sitting felt like waiting. Standing felt like thinking. 11 dead. 2 locations. Same method. No name attached, no connection to any house or faction, no explanation that fit anything the Watch had protocols for. She handed the page back without comment and looked out at the city. Someone was moving in the capital's shadow, and the Watch had nothing for it. That was the first problem. The second problem, which required no effort to identify, was that Tyrion had seen this first and had almost certainly already made contact with Varys before sending anyone out the gate. She knew how her brother worked. He would want to talk to this woman. Talking was his instrument of preference, and the infuriating reality was that he was usually right to reach for it. Send for Qyburn, she said. Her steward left. She remained at the window. The right question was not what this woman was. That could wait for better information. The right question was what she could become and in whose hands. No house name, no debt, No record in any ledger. The kind of presence that shifted the weight of a room simply by occupying it. Cersei had seen that kind of power before, understood its value and its danger. In the way only someone who had spent decades learning to redirect such things could understand. She needed to know more before she could decide which approach applied. Qyburn arrived quietly, as he always did. His eyes moved over her face once before settling into their usual attentive stillness. She told him the contents of the summary. He listened without interrupting, his best qualities, she had decided, in a city where almost everyone interrupted. 2 locations, he said when she finished. Consistent method. No theft. He pressed his fingertips together slowly. The cold is what interests me. Not the deaths themselves. Cold is a slow killer under normal conditions. What the account describes is something else. Something that acts in seconds rather than hours. He paused and something sharpened behind his eyes. The guard positions trouble me as well, if the accounts are accurate. The ice was thickest precisely at the 4 post positions. Not around the gate generally, specifically at the spots where men were standing. He looked at her. That suggests awareness of placement, attention to detail. This is not a force that moves without noticing what is in its way. Can it be countered? Everything can be countered given sufficient understanding of its nature. He did not say it as reassurance. He said it as a working principle. I would like to examine a body before the cold releases it. The tissue will tell me more than any account can. Arrange it. Quietly through channels outside the watch's record. Of course. He did not move to leave, which meant there was more. She waited. If the capacity is inherent to her, rather than applied, not alchemy, not a substance, not a device, then the source cannot be confiscated. But a thing that cannot be taken can still be redirected. He paused. Given the right conditions. Find out what you can, before this evening. He left without further comment, which she appreciated. She remained at the window. Tyrion would talk to her. Varys would map her movements and catalog her gaps. Littlefinger would try to find her price. None of them were wrong strategies. That was always the problem with clever men operating in the same space. They moved in useful directions, and you could never entirely determine which direction they would move in. She needed to move first, and differently. The 3 men Varys sent out reached the junction east of the city 2 hours before the light failed. They were not soldiers. The one leading them was a former watch lieutenant named Cass, a man whose departure from that position involved circumstances that remained technically unresolved and who had since made himself available to people who needed things handled without documentation. He carried a short sword that had not left its scabbard in 3 years. He preferred it that way. The 2 men with him were quieter younger and had been given the same instructions Cass had been given. Make contact, say the words, ride back with all limbs attached. They found the depot first. The ice was still there, smooth and thick around the gate, coating the post positions where the guards had stood. Cass walked the outer edge without touching the surface. One of the others moved toward the fence post to get a closer look, and Cass caught his arm without looking at him. They moved on without discussing it. The King's Road bend was a mile north. The bodies were gone, the wagon ruts visible where the grass had been pressed flat. The frost still tracing the willow roots in clean lines, despite hours of pale autumn sun. Cass stood at the bend and looked at the tree line. He caught her almost immediately. Not because she was visible exactly, but because his eye found the gap between the 2 oaks, and his mind understood before he had consciously processed it, that the stillness in that gap was not the stillness of empty space. She was 40 feet in, standing between the trunks, at the one angle that offered a clean sight line to both the road site and the approach from the depot. The position was not approximate. It was precise, chosen by someone who had surveyed the ground and selected accordingly. She had been there before they arrived. He was certain of it. Her hair was pale, drawn back from a face tilted slightly toward them, with an expression he could not immediately classify. Not threat, not welcome, not the careful neutrality of someone trying not to provoke. Something more deliberate than any of those. Assessment, maybe. The way you look at something when you are deciding what it is, and you already have several categories prepared. Cass held up a hand. His two companions went still. He took 3 steps toward the tree line and stopped. The air between him and the gap had changed a drop in temperature that had no source in the sky, above which was dry and pale and completely ordinary. "I carry a message from the hand of the king," he said. She looked at him, not at the 2 men behind him, not at the frost on the roots, at him specifically with the focused attention of someone who had already made a preliminary decision and was now checking it. "Tyrion Lannister asks for a meeting," Cass continued. "At whatever location you prefer. He did not send soldiers. He sent me, which he'd tell you is a distinction worth noting." She was quiet for a moment. "The hand," she said. Her voice was level lower than he'd expected, and completely without performance. "Yes." "Not the queen." The 2 words landed differently than the others. Not a question seeking confirmation. A test with a known answer, checking whether the man in front of her knew what he was carrying and what it meant that those 2 things, hand not queen, were different. Cass had been around enough political work to understand, in the half-second it took his mind to catch up to his instincts, that she had just mapped a piece of the city's internal structure from a single exchange. "No," he said. "Not the queen." Something shifted in her posture, not relaxation, more like a decision completing itself. "Tell him I will come to the city," she said. "Tomorrow, through the main gate." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "He should make certain his queen sends no one to meet me on the road." Cass absorbed that. "I'll pass it along." "Good." He took 2 steps backward before turning an instinct he didn't examine until he was already on the road and found himself listening hard for sound from the tree line behind him. There was none. When he glanced back, the gap between the 2 oaks was empty. Not recently vacated, simply empty as though it had been for some time. He did not know when she had moved. "Well," said the younger of the 2. Cass looked at the gap once more. Then he looked at the frost on the roots and the pale sky going dark at the eastern edge, and he thought about the position. She'd chosen the angle, the sight line, the certainty that she'd been there before they came. "Ride fast," he said. "And don't ask me what she looked like. I don't want to think about it yet." He didn't wait for a response. He was already moving. The gate watch changed at dawn. By the 2nd hour of morning, word had moved through the barracks nearest the outer wall. The way most things move through barracks, incompletely, with embellishment, and faster than anyone in authority would have preferred. What the men on duty at the main gate knew, assembled from fragments overheard, and half conversations interrupted, was this someone was expected. Someone unusual. The hand of the king had sent a rider out the previous afternoon, and the rider had come back with a message, and the message had resulted in a quiet word from the watch captain, that this morning's gate detail should conduct themselves with careful attention to composure. Which was not the gate sergeant noted privately, the kind of instruction you gave for a visiting merchant. He positioned his men with slightly more care than usual and said nothing about it. The morning traffic moved through in its ordinary rhythm. Carts, drovers, a wool merchant with 3 wagons, and a running argument with his assistant. 2 septons walking south, a pair of riders who identified themselves as outriders for a minor lordling and were waved through without incident. The sergeant logged the entries answered 2 questions about road conditions, and tracked the southern approach with the practiced peripheral awareness of a man who had been doing this long enough that his eyes did the work without being asked. He caught sight of her before the detail did. She was on foot. That was the first thing he registered. He had been expecting a horse, assuming anyone who could be called a threat would have the mobility of a horse. But she walked the King's Road approach at an unhurried pace with nothing behind her and nothing alongside her. No retinue, no wagon, no visible pack. She wore dark clothing with a military cut, the collar high against the cold, and she moved the way that people move when they have spent a long time covering ground on foot and no longer think about it. The sergeant raised his hand. His men came to attention. She reached the gate and stopped. Her pale blue eyes swept across him the way you sweep a stretch of road, noting it, cataloging it, moving on. She did not speak. "Your name and purpose," he said, because the protocol existed and because saying it gave him something to do with his mouth. "Esdeath," she said. "I have an appointment with the Hand." The sergeant had been told a name to expect. He had been told it quietly by a runner from the Tower of the Hand with the instruction that if a woman matching a certain description arrived and gave that name, she was to be admitted without delay and without additional questioning. He had understood from the tone of the instruction that without additional questioning was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "Welcome to King's Landing," he said. She held her gaze on him for a moment, not threateningly, carrying no readable emotion, but with the sustained focus of someone confirming a preliminary assessment. Then she walked through the gate. His men held their positions. Nobody spoke. One of the horses, tied to the post ring 20 feet inside the wall, shifted and sidled and pulled at the rope with a flat, nervous energy that had nothing to do with the cart noise or the morning crowd. The sergeant studied it for a moment, then turned back to the road. He wrote her name in the log. Then he stared at what he had written and felt, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, that the record was going to matter later. The street of steel was loud at this hour. Hammers, bellows, the sharp, high ring of metal on metal that never quite resolved into silence, even in the pauses between strikes. Esdeath walked it without hurrying, which meant she walked it slowly enough that the people around her had time to register her before she had passed. The first thing that struck the people close enough to see her clearly was the stillness. Not stillness in the sense of being motionless. She was walking clearly, but the kind that exists at the center of something. The way the eye of a storm is calm while everything around it is not. People stepped aside. Not dramatically, not in a rush, but with the small involuntary adjustments that bodies make when they sense something in their path that the mind hasn't fully named yet. A fishmonger mid-argument about the price of his morning catch went silent between one word and the next. His customer turned to see what had stopped him. The customer found nothing that obviously explained the fishmonger's face, which was not fear exactly, but sat close enough to it to be uncomfortable, the face of a man whose instincts had sent a message his reasoning hadn't caught up with. 3 children who had been chasing something along the gutter stopped running. They stood at the street's edge and watched her pass with the fixed, unblinking absorption that children bring to things they haven't been given a category for yet. A city watchman at the corner where the street of steel met the lane toward the harbor stepped back 1 pace, purely reflexive, then caught himself straightened and stared at a point ahead of him, as though that had always been his intention. Esdeath took all of it in. She registered the layout of the street, the positions of the watch posts, the distance between the main thoroughfare and the narrower lanes branching off it, the state of the upper-story windows, which buildings ran solid stone frontage and which used cheaper timber. She clocked the smell of the harbor, the direction of forge smoke, the angle of morning light on the upper walls of the red keep visible above the roofline to the northeast. She was not cataloging the way a traveler catalogs a new city. She was surveying. The distinction to anyone who might have understood what they were watching was significant. Tyrion met her in the lower yard of the Red Keep, which he had chosen deliberately over the formal receiving chambers above. Those rooms sent a message about hierarchy. The open yard was neutral, the closest to honest he could arrange on short notice. He had one man with him, a guard whose function was presence rather than protection there, because arriving entirely alone would have communicated something different. The man stood to Tyrion's right and slightly back, and had been told clearly not to put his hand anywhere near his sword. Esdeath walked into the yard and stopped. Tyrion had assembled several versions of this moment in his mind, since reading the accounts the previous morning, the useful habit of a man who survived primarily by anticipating how conversations went wrong. He had prepared for tall, and she was tall, for composed, and she was that. He had the military cut of her clothing from Cass's account. What he hadn't prepared for was the weight of stillness she carried into the space, or the way the temperature in the yard felt in some way he couldn't immediately rationalize, about 2 degrees colder than it had been before she arrived. He also hadn't prepared for the way she took him in, without the small recalibration that people usually performed when they saw him for the first time, the adjustment he had spent a lifetime learning to read and preempt. She studied him the way she had apparently studied the gate sergeant, noting what was there, classifying it, moving on to the next useful piece of information. He found somewhat to his own surprise that he preferred it. "My Lord Hand," she said. The title carried no weight in her mouth, not irony, not deference. The correct term used correctly as a starting point. "I'm told you prefer directness," Tyrion said, "which I've been told about myself, so I suggest we skip the portion where we're civil to each other in ways neither of us means." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile. The acknowledgement of a point received. "You have a proposal," she said. "I have questions first. You can decide after whether a proposal is worth your time." He moved to the low bench along the yard wall and sat, because standing for long periods was not something his body managed elegantly, and because sitting also placed her above him in the physical space, which was a small concession he made deliberately. 11 men in 2 days. No theft. 1 witness left alive at each scene. He tipped his head up toward her. "You wanted to be found. I'd like to know why you wanted it to be us who found you." She held the pause for a moment, not evasion. The beat of someone deciding how much of an accurate answer was worth giving. "I wanted to see what this city sent when it had a problem it didn't understand," she said. "And it sent 3 men who knew better than to reach for their swords." A pause, brief and clean. That was more interesting than I expected. Tyrion absorbed that. "I sent them instead of soldiers because soldiers would have communicated that we considered force the right instrument. Clearly it isn't." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. So." He leaned back against the cold stone. "What is the right instrument from your perspective?" She weighed him for a moment genuinely, not as threat assessment, but as the evaluation of whether the question came from someone worth answering. Then she turned her head and fixed her gaze on the upper wall of the Red Keep, the battlements, the towers, the dark windows of the floors above. Something in the angle of her attention shifted. She took in the keep the way she had taken in the city on the way through, not as a visitor confronting an impressive structure, but as something that was measuring it. "Your city is poorly defended," she said. "Your watch is undermanned and untrained for anything beyond common crime. Your gate protocol relies on reputation and paperwork rather than actual capacity." She brought her gaze back to him. "If I had wanted to cause you a serious problem, I would not have walked through the main gate." Flat. Without heat. Also, Tyrion knew, without needing to confirm it accurate. "I know," he said. "Then you understand what you're asking." I understand that you're capable of considerably more than what you've shown us. He held her gaze, which required a deliberate effort he hoped didn't show. I also understand that you walked through the main gate this morning, publicly, in daylight, which means you want something from this city that requires the city to remain functional. He paused. Otherwise, you wouldn't care about the condition of its walls. She regarded him for a long moment. You're not stupid, she said. No warmth in it, but not empty either. The character of a fact being recorded, filed under relevant. I try not to be, Tyrion said. It limits my options. The temperature in the yard had not shifted in any way a thermometer would have measured. But something in the air between them had changed, a slight easing of the charge that had been present since she came through the gate, as though whatever preliminary calibration she'd been running had reached a working conclusion. I will stay in the city, she said. For now. I will not serve your queen. She said your queen without inflection, which was somehow more dismissive than contempt would have been. I will not swear oaths. I will not wear your colors. A pause. If something in this city requires dealing with, and I find it worth dealing with, I will deal with it. On my terms. Tyrion turned this over. That's not an arrangement most people in this building would accept. I'm not offering it to most people in this building. No, he agreed. You're offering it to me. A beat, because you've decided I'm the one most likely to understand what it actually means. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. Tyrion stood more effort from a cold stone bench than from a proper chair and straightened his coat. I'll need to manage the Queen's expectations. That will take some work. That's your problem, Esdeath said. In the precise flatness of it was something that might, in a different person, under different circumstances, have passed for dry amusement. It usually is, Tyrion said. He tilted his head up toward her, the full measure of the height difference, which was considerable, and found the experience not entirely unlike standing at the base of a wall and taking its height. The scale was real. The structure was sound, and the sensible response was not to pretend it was smaller than it was. I'll have quarters arranged, he said. Not in the main keep. Something with its own entrance. Good. She turned and walked back toward the yard gate. He watched her go. The dark clothing, the pale hair, the way the space around her reorganized itself slightly as she moved through it. The way the guard to his right was carefully, professionally not tracking her, while tracking her with every sense he had that wasn't his eyes. When she had passed through the gate and out of sight, the guard exhaled. Tyrion had not noticed the man holding his breath. He suspected the man hadn't either. He stood alone in the yard for a moment in the cold that stayed longer than it should have, and thought about walls. Then he went inside to begin managing the Queen's expectations, which was going to be exactly as unpleasant as he'd known it would be. The trouble in Flea Bottom had been building for 11 days. It started as most trouble in that part of the capital started with something small. A grain merchant who had raised his prices 3 times in a fortnight, citing shortages that nobody else could confirm. By the 4th day, there had been pushing in the queue outside his storehouse. By the 7th, there had been a knife and a man bleeding in the mud, and a crowd of 40 who had decided that 40 was enough to make decisions without reference to anyone's authority. By the 11th day, the merchant's storehouse had been emptied, twice. 2 patrol officers had been driven off with thrown stones, and worse, and the area around the old tannery had become the kind of ground where the guard didn't go in pairs anymore. They went in groups, or they didn't go at all. The watch captain assigned to the lower wards was a man named Dowen, 20 years in the position, gray, at the temples worn down in the specific way of someone who had spent 2 decades managing the line between order and chaos in a district that treated the line as a suggestion. He had filed 3 requests for additional men in the past week. He had received acknowledgement of all 3, which was the administrative equivalent of being told to manage. He was sitting in his post reading his own 3rd request and not finding it encouraging when the door opened and a woman walked in. He had seen her the day before. Not up close, he had been at the gate junction when she came through the main entrance, had watched from a distance as she moved up the street of steel and the street went quiet in her wake. He had filed that observation away under a category he didn't have a name for yet. Now she was in his post, which was a small and badly lit room that smelled of tallow and wet wool, and she was studying his wall. He had a map of the lower wards pinned up there. He used it for route planning and incident tracking, with marks in different colors indicating the nature and frequency of unrest across the district. The area around the old tannery had a concentration of red marks that made that section of the map look like a wound. She took it in for a long moment without speaking. "Can I help you?" Dowan said, because something had to be said. "The area near the tannery," she said. "How many men are holding position there now?" "None. We pulled back yesterday. It wasn't safe to maintain posts without reinforcement, and the reinforcement hasn't come." "How many in the group holding the ground?" Dowan set down his request. "Varies. Core is maybe 30. Others around that folk who join when momentum is going their direction." He paused. "Who sent you?" She didn't answer. She was still taking in the map. After a moment, the merchant. Is he responsible for the shortage, or is the shortage real? It was not the question he had expected. Both, possibly. There are real gaps in supply. The war disrupted 2 of the main Crownlands routes. But he's also pricing against fear, not against actual stock. He knows frightened buyers pay more. So the crowd is wrong about the method, but not about the cause. More or less. She turned from the wall. "I'll go this afternoon." "Go," Dowan repeated. "You'll go." "To the tannery area," said the way you say a thing that is already settled. "Alone." Dowan thought about the officers driven off with stones. He thought about the knife on the 4th day, the man bleeding in the mud, the 40 who had become 60, and the way a mass like that tends to grow when nothing opposes it. He thought about what he had seen yesterday on the street of steel, the fishmonger going silent mid-sentence, the watchman stepping back 1 pace, and then pretending he hadn't the horse pulling hard at its rope for no reason the eye could find. He did not tell her it wasn't safe. The words simply didn't arrive. "I'll want an account afterward," he said instead. She was already moving toward the door. "You'll have one." Tyrion heard about it from Varys, which was how he heard about most matters that happened below the level of formal record. He was in his chair with a book he wasn't reading when Varys arrived, settled across from him, and relayed what his network had observed near the old tannery between the 2nd and 3rd hours of the afternoon. Tyrion listened without interrupting. When Varys finished, Tyrion set the book down. "How many?" he said. By the time she arrived, the crowd had grown to approximately 70. 3 improvised barricades across the 2 main approaches. The patrol had not attempted to re-enter since the previous day. Varys folded his hands. She went in through the side lane, alone. No announcement, no demand for dispersal, no warning of any kind, my network observed. And after, it took considerably less time than the situation warranted. A pause. "The barricades are gone. The ground is clear. The core of 30 or so who had been holding it are no longer present. Several appear to have left the capital entirely. Others are in the cells below the Gate of the Gods, which they entered on their own initiative. Initiative according to the officers on duty, which is not something that typically happens." Tyrion was quiet. "On their own initiative." That is what the officers recorded. Because the alternative was whatever she made clear the alternative was. Varys tilted his head slightly. I'd frame it differently. From what my people gathered, she didn't threaten them directly. She stated one thing, then acted. The men who chose the cells did so because they had seen what acting looked like and made a calculation. He paused. Which is, if anything, more efficient than a direct threat. Threats can be tested. A demonstration cannot. Tyrion stood and moved to the window. The lower districts were visible from here, the close-packed rooftops, the smoke, the harbor line, going gray in the fading light. He thought about 70 men, a fortnight of accumulated grievance, and the 3 minutes between Esdeath entering the side lane and the first of them deciding the cells were preferable. The merchant Fisim, he said. What became of him? Alive and unharmed. He has reduced his prices to approximately fair market rate and made a donation to the distribution houses in the lower ward. A beat. The donation was substantial, unprompted according to his own account, which I find somewhat difficult to credit. Tyrion turned from the window. She didn't kill anyone. None my network can confirm. There was ice a considerable amount by several descriptions. Its application is characterized variously depending on the witness. Another pause. One man who walked out and spoke to the patrol officers before being taken in said she addressed the crowd before doing anything else. He retained it clearly. What did she say? Varys considered the phrasing. She said, "You have a legitimate complaint and a poor method." I'm not here about the complaint. Tyrion absorbed that. Turned it twice. That's not what a soldier says, he said. No. Varys leaned forward slightly, not much, but enough to signal he had his own reading. It's also not a threat, it's a distinction. She separated their grievance from their conduct and told them only the conduct was within her scope. Which means she understood the grievance, dismissed it as irrelevant to the immediate situation, and communicated both things simultaneously. He sat back. Most enforcers don't bother with that kind of precision. It takes more effort than simply applying force. It's worse than a brute, Tyrion said. A brute who clears a crowd because they're inconvenient is legible. Someone who grasps why the crowd formed sets that aside as immaterial and clears them anyway. That's a different kind of statement about how she sees the world. Yes, Varys said. It is. And it will be interpreted by everyone who hears the account as exactly what it is. They sat with that. The mood in the lower ward, Tyrion asked. Quiet. The patrol has re-established posts in the tannery district without incident. Several merchants who had been running inflated prices have adjusted. Varys paused. There is also noticeably less disorder in the lanes between the gate and the harbor than there was 2 days ago. Not because of additional patrol coverage, because residents are being careful. Careful, Tyrion said. Because nobody knows what she'll decide is worth her attention next. That is the prevailing reasoning, yes. Though I'd note the uncertainty is doing as much work as the fear. They don't know her limits. Not knowing is its own constraint. Tyrion sat back down. He picked up the book, considered it, set it aside. Cersei, he said. She received word before I arrived here. Initial response satisfaction as expected. Secondary response, once the satisfaction ran its course, was to ask why the woman hadn't presented herself at the throne room. Varys's tone carried no judgment. Her steward phrased it more diplomatically than that. Because she doesn't present herself anywhere she hasn't chosen. Tyrion rubbed his face with one hand. What did you tell them? That the arrangement runs through the Hand's office and that a full briefing would follow at the appropriate time. He added with mild precision, the appropriate time being yours to determine. Which gives me until tomorrow morning. Tyrion stood again, thinking while stationary had never suited him. Here is the difficulty. Cersei will read today as confirmation that Esdeath can be directed. She'll move to direct her. Almost certainly. And every attempt to put structure around that woman will peel back faster than the attempt before it. Until the attempts stop working, and Cersei has to decide what to do next, which is when this becomes genuinely dangerous. He moved to the window a second time. The forge smoke had settled over the lower rooftops, the harbor gone to dark gray. I need Cersei to feel she has a hand on this without actually reaching for it. Give her the credit, Varys said. Framed today as the result of her initiative in authorizing the arrangement. Let her enjoy the outcome publicly. It occupies her attention and reduces the urgency to establish direct control. That holds until Esdeath does something Cersei didn't authorize and can't retrospectively claim. True, but it buys time. Varys rose from the chair, and in this situation, time is not a small thing. No, Tyrion agreed. It isn't. That evening, in a room on the outer ring of the Red Keep stone walls, a private entrance off a secondary yard. No attendants she hadn't chosen herself. Esdeath stood at the window and took in the capital below. Torches were going up along the main routes, lanterns in the upper story windows, the dim reddish spread of the harbor district where the night trade ran. From here she could see 3 patrol posts, their positions, their spacing, the numbers manning each. She could see the gap in coverage between the tannery district and the lane that ran east toward the fish market. She could see which buildings offered multiple exits and which offered one. She had not been asked to map any of this. She did it the way she did everything, because knowing the ground under your feet was not preparation, it was reflex. The thing that ran without instruction, because stopping it had never been an option worth considering. King's Landing was loud even at this hour. Voices wheels the distant clang from the harbor. An undisciplined kind of noise, the noise of a place that had never been taught what quiet indicated about power. The afternoon in the tannery district had given her a working picture of what this place's weaknesses actually were. Not enemies. Not war. Not any threat it lacked the capacity to address. It had a shortage. It was mismanaging a mass of angry residents it had let expand because no one wanted to bear the responsibility of stopping it, and a patrol force so depleted and uncertain it had retreated from its own assigned territory. None of these were serious. They were the accumulated failures of a place that had been permitted to drift. She had not gone to the tannery district as a service to anyone. She had gone because the map on Dowan's wall had interested her, the concentration of red marks, the shape of something unresolved. Because resolving it required a willingness to apply force and accept the disapproval that came with it. She had gone to determine whether this capital drew a distinction between a challenge it lacked the means to address and one it simply lacked the will to. The answer was that it had mostly stopped distinguishing. It had drifted, and drift was a different kind of weakness than deliberate softness. Deliberate softness had a logic that could be engaged. Drift could be turned. Across the roof lines on the hill at the center of the district, the upper towers of the Red Keep were still lit. Several somebodies working late. They were trying to determine what she was. She let them. They would reach conclusions. Some would be accurate. None would be complete, and that suited her. Incomplete readings in people who held nominal power had been in her experience consistently useful. They spent their energy managing the parts of her they thought they understood and left the rest alone. Below the window, the capital spread out loud and lit and dense, and underneath all of it, softer than it had any reason to be. She had a great deal of time. 3 days after the tannery district went quiet, a man named Osric was flogged in the square outside the Great Sept. He had been a grain factor, not the merchant Esdeath had visited a different one, smaller, operating out of a warehouse near the Street of Flour. The charge brought against him by the Faith was profiteering during shortage, which was not a legal charge in any crown court, but was a moral charge in the court of public accusation, which in King's Landing carried considerably more immediate weight. The Faith militant had the right under agreements with the crown that had been allowed to calcify over decades of inattention to conduct public penances for what they termed sins against the community. The flogging drew a gathering of several hundred. Esdeath watched from the edge of the square. She had not come for this. She had been moving through the district on her own schedule, mapping the western approaches to the Great Sept, when the assembly had formed and the proceedings begun. She watched the way she watched most things, without expression, with complete attention, cataloging what she saw. What she saw was this: a man who had done approximately what the merchant near the tannery had done, being punished by a body that had no army, no official sanction from the throne, and no instrument of enforcement beyond the onlookers' willingness to stand there and agree the punishment was just. And they were willing. Several hundred of them standing in the morning cold, watching a man take 30 lashes because a group of men in rough robes had decided he should. 30 lashes for raising prices. She had killed 11 men, and the capital had sent 3 people to find her. This man had raised prices, and 300 had come to watch him bleed. She filed that observation carefully. The militant conducting the penance were 7 men, not large, not physically imposing, carrying no weapons beyond a short staff each. Their standing was entirely constructed from the posture of the onlookers around them. Remove that mass of witnesses, and they were 7 men with sticks. Keep it, and they were the voice of something that reached into every household in the district and told residents what to be ashamed of. That was the mechanism. She understood it now in the way she understood everything, not academically, but as a structural assessment. The weight-bearing elements. The point where pressure applied would produce the most significant response. She stayed until the flogging ended. Then she walked into the square. She did not interfere with the penance itself. It was already over. What she did was simpler. She walked to the center of the square, past those still dispersing, past the militant escorting the man away, and she stood in front of the small stone altar that served as the focal point of outdoor observances near the septine. It was a modest thing, knee-high, with carved faces of the 7 worn smooth by weather and touching. Candles around the base, fresh flowers on the top surface placed that morning by someone who had taken the time. She studied it for a long moment. Then she sat on it. Not with ceremony, not with a statement. She settled onto the altar the way you settle onto a garden wall when you want to look at something from a better angle. Hands on her knees, her attention moving across the square as though the stone beneath her was entirely neutral ground. It took approximately 4 seconds for someone in the remaining mass to notice. It took approximately 15 more for the sound of the square to change the low ambient noise of a dispersing gathering, shifting into something else entirely. A catch and hold, the specific silence of witnesses who have seen something and haven't yet agreed on what it means. One of the militant turned back. He was lean, close-cropped, barefooted, someone who had taken the austerity seriously rather than performing it. He stopped 6 feet from her and stared. Whatever script existed for this situation, and there was clearly no script for this situation, it was not loading quickly. "That is a sacred altar," he said. Esdeath looked at him. "I know." "You cannot." He stopped, started again. "You are desecrating holy ground." "I'm sitting on a rock," she said. "The rock is yours. I am not yours." His jaw tightened. Behind him, the other 6 had turned. 300 witnesses who had come to watch a flogging were now watching something else. And the something else had not resolved into a recognizable category. Yet nobody had decided whether to be offended or entertained or frightened. And the overlap between all three was considerable. "Remove yourself." His voice had steadied. He had found the tone, the one that worked in front of gatherings, the low authority of someone speaking on behalf of something larger than themselves. "In the name of the seven." "No," Esdeath said, "just that. No elaboration, no counter-argument." The word landed in the square with the same character as the temperature drop that preceded her ability, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that had no opening for negotiation. The militant stared at her. She looked back at him with the mild assessing expression she brought to most things, someone genuinely curious what he would do next, with no investment in which option he chose. He chose correctly. He turned and went to find someone more senior. The High Sparrow received the account before the midday bell. He was in the lower chambers of the Great Sept when the messenger came to him, breathless, struggling to frame what had happened in terms that conveyed the severity without sounding unbalanced. The High Sparrow listened with his eyes closed and his hands folded. When the account ended, he was still for a moment. Then he said, "She sat on the altar." "Yes, Father." "Refused to move when asked." "Yes, Father." "And told you the rock was yours, but she was not." "Yes, Father." The High Sparrow opened his eyes, pale and steady, giving nothing away about what was happening behind them. He rose from his seat slowly, as he did everything, and moved to the narrow window overlooking the capital's lower districts, its rooftops and smoke and density of inhabited lives. "She has been here 3 days, he said. "In those 3 days, the tannery district has calmed. 2 merchants have lowered their prices, and the patrol has reclaimed positions it had abandoned." A beat, not a pause, deliberate placed. "She has done what our sermons could not." The messenger said nothing, because this was not the direction he had expected. "And now she has sat on our altar," the High Sparrow continued, "in public in front of 300 witnesses, and declined to move when asked in the name of the seven." He turned from the window. His expression was not anger. It was something more considered the face of a man who has received a challenge and is already determining the field on which to answer it. She is telling this capital that there is nothing in it she acknowledges as standing above her. She is not saying it to us. She is saying it to everyone who is in that square. "What do we do, Father?" "We do what we always do," the High Sparrow said. "We speak, clearly and to as many as will hear." He folded his hands. "She has opened a conversation. We will continue it in our terms, not hers." Tyrion heard about it from Biren, which was unusual enough that the young secretary's face communicated the category of news before a word was spoken. Tyrion listened with his cup half raised and forgot to drink. When Byron finished, the cup came down carefully. "She sat on the altar," Tyrion said. "Yes, my lord." "Outside the Great Sept." "Yes." "In front of several hundred witnesses who had just watched a penance." "The estimate is between 200 and 300, my lord." Tyrion looked at the wall, then the ceiling. Then he stood. "Fine, Varys. Not at his convenience now," already moving toward the door. "And send word to Cersei's steward that I'll be at the Solar within the hour." "Should I say, why, my lord?" He stopped at the door. "Tell them it's about managing something before it manages itself." A beat. "Actually, don't. Just say I'm coming." He went. Then the news moved through King's Landing the way news always moved faster at ground level. more distorted at each remove from the source. By the afternoon bells, the accounts circulating through taverns and market stalls had grown considerably. The altar had become a shrine. The confrontation had become a standoff with ice involved, or fired, depending on the teller. Esdeath had spoken at length, or said nothing, or laughed. What did not get distorted was the core she had sat on something sacred and refused to stand when the faith demanded it. For one portion of the capital, this landed as perhaps intended a demonstration that nothing in King's Landing held standing above her own will. That portion was split between finding this impressive and finding it deeply unsettling, with substantial overlap between the two. For another portion, the response ran differently. Not the formally devout, not the ones who attended services weekly, gave to the poor kitchens and believed in the seven, with the conviction of people who had genuinely chosen to. These were the ones for whom the faith represented something more diffuse, the idea that the world had a moral structure, that there were limits on what strength could do, that even the most formidable were answerable to something beyond themselves. The sept, the altar, the carved faces of the seven. These were the symbolic infrastructure of that idea. A person could be lapsed, cynical, barely observant, and still need that infrastructure to exist. For them, what Esdeath had done was not an offense against organized worship. It was a provocation against the concept of limit itself. By evening, the High Sparrow had addressed those assembled outside the Great Sept. He did not name her. He spoke about those who mistake the absence of punishment for the absence of consequence, and about the difference between standing granted by the divine and standing seized by the hand. He spoke without theatrical emphasis, which made it more effective, the tone of a man not performing indignation, but stating observations. The gathering listened. It grew as he spoke. In the Red Keep, Tyrion sat across from Cersei and explained with the specific patience he reserved for conversations where the stakes were high and his counterpart was liable to accelerate the damage, what had happened and what it meant. Cersei heard him out with her hands in her lap, and her face doing the careful work of a person who has not yet decided what they actually feel about something and is not going to commit before they do. "She did this deliberately," Cersei said when he finished. "Yes. Not because she has any grievance against the faith. Because she wanted to see what it would do. That's my reading." Cersei was still for a moment. "And now the faith will act. And whatever it does will show either that it has some hold on her or that it doesn't." "Yes," Tyrion said. "And either result matters. If they demonstrate they can't touch her, they lose standing in front of everyone who watched. If they somehow do constrain her..." He stopped. "Then we have a different set of problems than we currently have." Cersei's jaw was set. She should have been told not to go near the sept. "Told," Tyrion said, with the measured tone of someone conveying a meaning without stating it. A silence fell between them, not comfortable. "I understand to you," Cersei said. She turned toward the window. The light outside had gone, the capital below reduced to torchlight and shadow. "What does she actually want from this?" "To locate the real limits, Tyrion said. "Not the official ones, not the written ones, the limits that will push back with enough force to matter. She's been in this city 4 days, and she's already found 2 things worth testing." He leaned back. "The question is whether either of them produces an answer she hasn't already expected." Cersei said nothing for a long time after that. Through the high window of the solar distant singing rose from somewhere in the lower districts, a hymn carried by many voices, the sound a city makes when it has decided something significant is occurring and wants to demonstrate that it knows. Neither of them remarked on it. The summons went out the morning after the High Sparrow's address. Not a legal summons, the faith had no mechanism for that, and everyone in King's Landing understood this while simultaneously behaving as though it didn't apply. It went out as an invitation to public testimony, which was the faith's preferred instrument, not a court in the crown's sense, but an assembly of witnesses before whom a matter of moral weight would be examined. The distinction was significant and also entirely meaningless in practice, because when 300 people came to watch someone be examined, the experience of the person being examined was indistinguishable from trial. The notice went to the quarters Tyrion had arranged for Esdeath. Hand-delivered by a boy of perhaps 12 in the rough clothes of a sparrow's runner who left it at the door and was gone before whoever opened it could decide whether to question him. Esdeath read it, set it on the table, went back to what she had been doing, which was reviewing a hand-drawn map of the outer wall and its approaches she had acquired from a cartographer in the lower districts 2 days prior. She read it again an hour later. Then she placed it face down. In the Tower of the Hand. Tyrion received a copy before the morning was out. Varys had obtained it through channels that did not require explaining, and read it twice with his elbows on the table and his chin on his hands. "They've set it for this afternoon," Varys said. "I see that." Tyrion set the page down. They move quickly when they feel they have momentum. The address last evening drew considerably more than the night before. The estimate is somewhere between 800 and 1,000 by the time he finished. Varys folded his hands. "That is not a number to dismiss." "No," Tyrion said. "It isn't." He stood and moved as he often did when his mind was working ahead of his words. "They're trying to get her into a position where refusing to appear is itself a statement, an admission in the court of public perception that she fears their judgment. And appearing is only marginally better, because the entire structure of the thing is designed to place her inside a frame she didn't build and make her answer questions she didn't choose." "It is an elegant instrument," Varys said. "It has worked on queens." "It has worked on queens," Tyrion agreed. "The question is whether it works on someone who doesn't acknowledge that the instrument has standing." He turned the page over. "She'll go." Varys tilted his head. "You're confident of that?" "She walked through the main gate. She sat on their altar in public. She's not the type to refuse a direct engagement that would be evasion, and evasion implies concern about the outcome." He set the page down. "She'll go. What she does when she gets there is the part I can't predict."
Autorta.
The sept's broad steps and approach filled by mid-afternoon. It had grown considerably since the notice went out. Word moves through a city the way water moves through cracks, finding every gap, filling every available space. And by the appointed hour, what had been an estimated 300 the previous evening had become something closer to 1,500. They stood on the steps along the sept's outer walls in the street beyond. Merchants had closed stalls to come and watch. Off-duty patrol officers stood in groups at the edge. Several minor lords had sent household members to observe and report. The High Sparrow stood at the top of the steps, flanked by 6 senior faithful, and behind them, a line of militant in rough gray. He did not require elevation for authority. He was, if anything, shorter than most, but the architecture gave the steps a natural stage, and he understood architecture the way he understood most things as a tool. He did not begin when Esdeath arrived. He waited until she had walked through the approach past those lining the walls and reached a position roughly equidistant between the mass of onlookers and the steps. Until she was, whether she chose to frame it this way or not, the center of the space. Then he spoke. "You came," he said. His voice carried without effort the practiced projection of someone who had spent years making himself heard in large spaces. "I am grateful." Esdeath said nothing. "We are not here to accuse you," he said. "We are here to bear witness. There is a difference." He moved one step down, then another, bringing himself a fraction closer, not to confront, but to draw the space between them into the same shared ground as those watching. You have been in this city for 4 days. In those 4 days, you have killed 11 men, cleared a district the patrol had abandoned, and sat upon a sacred altar and refused to rise when asked in the name of the Seven. A breath, the natural rhythm of a man who speaks as a form of devotion. These are facts. We do not dispute them. The sept's approach went very still. 1,500 who had come expecting confrontation were getting something more unsettling than confrontation. They were getting calmness, and calmness from the faith in the face of this woman had the quality of someone walking toward a fire rather than away from it. What we ask is simpler than accusation. The High Sparrow continued. We ask that you answer before I'll hear one question. He looked at her steadily. Is there anything in this world you consider yourself answerable to? It was Tyrion would later tell Varys, when reconstructing the scene from the 3 accounts he assembled, exactly the right question. Not because it had a good answer available to her, because it had no answer that didn't either concede his frame or confirm what everyone present already believed. If she said yes, the faith would spend the next hour determining whether that thing existed here. If she said no, she had declared in front of 1,500 people that she acknowledged nothing above herself. Esdeath stood in the center of the open space and fixed her gaze on the High Sparrow. Not up at him, they were close enough in elevation by this point that the angle was nearly level. She regarded him the way she had regarded everything in this capital as a structural problem. Weight-bearing elements, stress points, the mechanism. One question, she said. One question, he confirmed. Then here is mine. She turned not to the High Sparrow, but to the 1,500 on the steps and in the street beyond. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The approach had gone so still that it carried without effort. Before I came here, the patrol had abandoned its posts in the tannery district. A factor named Osric was flogged in this square for raising prices. Crime in the lanes between the gate and the harbor ran as it wished. She brought her gaze back to the High Sparrow. Where were your sermons then? The hush held. I do not ask what you speak about, she said. I ask what you have stopped. Name me one specific thing, one place, one man, one act that your words alone have prevented. The High Sparrow was still for a moment. A different kind of stillness than his deliberate pauses, narrower, compressed. He had anticipated a refusal to engage. He had not anticipated a counter-question that turned the entire assembly back on itself. The soul is not a district to be policed, he said. We speak to what is inside men. What you are describing is irrelevant to those who cannot eat, Esdeath said. Flat without heat. You ask me what I am answerable to. I ask you what you have actually done. She moved forward 1 pace. A man was flogged here yesterday for selling grain above the price you decided was moral. He committed no crime under the Crown's law. What you administered was not justice. It was demonstration. Another pace. I have also administered demonstration. The difference is that mine required no one's belief. The open ground went completely still. 1,500 who had come expecting the faith to hold its position were standing in a space where the exchange had shifted in a way none of them had anticipated. It was not that the High Sparrow had been defeated in logic. Several people present could have constructed a counter-argument. It was that Esdeath had in 4 sentences placed the question of effectiveness alongside the question of moral standing, and asked those assembled to decide which they considered more real. The High Sparrow understood this. He was not a man who had survived as long as he had by failing to read the room he was standing in. He descended 2 more steps. He was level with her now, or nearly. You speak of what can be seen and measured, he said. I do not doubt your effectiveness. I have said as much. His voice had not hardened. If anything, it dropped the specific register of someone who has chosen not to compete on the other person's ground, but to hold their own. But effectiveness is not the same as right. And a city that abandons the question of right in favor of the question of effectiveness has already abandoned it, Esdeath said, long before I arrived. That landed. Not because it was clever, it was simply accurate, and its accuracy was visible to everyone present who had spent any amount of time in the streets of King's Landing and understood what the city actually was, as opposed to what it was supposed to be. The High Sparrow stood at the same level as her, and the open ground held its collective breath, and for a long moment it was genuinely unclear what the next several seconds would produce. Then the High Sparrow did something that required more composure than almost anything else available to him. In that moment he nodded. "That is true," he said. It was a concession of the narrowest kind, acknowledging the fact, while not yielding the principle, and it was the most effective response available to him, because it prevented the moment from becoming a rout. He was not capitulating. He was refusing to break. "What you describe is a wound we have also tried to heal," he said, "by different means, with different tools." He turned slightly toward those lining the steps. "And I tell you now, before all here, that what she offers order without conscience is a wound of its own kind. One that does not show until it has gone very deep." He had recovered the room. Not fully, but enough. Several hundred of those watching were nodding, or had at least stopped the unconscious lean toward Esdeath that had begun when she answered. Esdeath observed the recovery, the precise sequence of acknowledgement. Repositioning appealed to the larger frame with the same attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she did not respond. She had nothing to respond to. He had said nothing she was required to answer. She turned and walked back through the sept's approach. That was the moment the space changed, not when she had spoken, not when the High Sparrow had steadied, but when she turned and left without ceremony, without acknowledging those present, without looking back. The 1,500 watched her go and found themselves somewhere none of them had entirely expected. They had come to watch a confrontation, and they had seen one. The faith had held, had if anything finished the exchange without being broken. But she had left, on her own terms at the moment. She chose without anything in that space stopping her, or calling her back, or extracting from her anything she hadn't chosen to give. That was the thing that settled over the approach, like the cold she left behind her. Not defeat, not victory, something more uncomfortable than either. Tyrion received the account in 3 separate versions from Varys' network, from Biren, who had gone to observe, and from a minor lord's household member who came to the Tower of the Hand that evening, seemingly compelled to tell someone in authority what he had seen. Tyrion listened to all 3. They differed in detail. They agreed on the core. He sat with it for a long time. "She didn't win," he said to Varys. "She didn't lose. She demonstrated that the argument itself wasn't the point." "Yes," Varys said. "The High Sparrow held. He's capable. He'll use this, frame it as the faith standing firm in the face of something monstrous and emerging with its principles intact." Tyrion rubbed his eyes. "And he's not entirely wrong. He did hold." "He did," Varys agreed. "But holding is not the same as prevailing. And the 1,500 people at the Sept this afternoon have now spent several hours thinking about the gap between moral standing and practical effect." He stopped, then continued more quietly. "Some will decide the High Sparrow won the exchange. Some will decide she did. But a third group, the largest I suspect, though it will not announce itself, will simply begin to wonder for the first time whether the exchange was the point." Tyrion looked at him. They will start asking, Varys said, which of the two of them has actually changed anything? The room held no sound at all for a moment. That Tyrion said, is the most dangerous outcome. Yes, Varys said. It is. Outside the capital made its evening sounds, the harbor, the forges, cooling the distant bells of the great sept, ringing the hour. They rang as they always did, clearly, and across the whole of King's Landing. Tonight Tyrion thought a few more people heard them differently than they had the day before. The meeting in Cersei's Solar took place the morning after the confrontation at the sept, with 4 people present and a 5th conspicuously absent. Cersei sat. Tyrion stood near the window. Qyburn occupied a chair with the composed attentiveness of a man who was always recording. Varys stood near the door, which was his preference, close to the exit, close to the hinges, where voices carried best through stone. The absent 5th was Esdeath, which was the subject of the meeting. She has been here 6 days, Cersei said. In 6 days she has killed 11 men, established a form of order in the lower wards that the Watch has been unable to maintain for months. Publicly humiliated a faction that has been a thorn in this crown's side since before Blackwater, and made 1,500 of our citizens spend an evening wondering whether the faith or she represents the more useful form of authority. She paused. I want to hear proposals. Qyburn spoke first, which was unusual. He typically let the chamber exhaust its obvious ideas before offering his own. A formal rank, he said. Something with weight. Commander of the city's peace or similar. It formalizes her function, gives her a defined scope, and most importantly, gives the crown the standing to define what falls outside that scope. She won't take it as a constraint, Tyrion said. No, Qyburn agreed. But it gives us the language to call her beyond scope when she acts beyond it. That is not nothing. It is almost nothing, Tyrion said. The moment she acts beyond it, which she will, we're left choosing between enforcing a designation she doesn't recognize or allowing the designation to become meaningless. Either way, we lose the instrument. Cersei looked at Varys. You're quiet. I'm thinking, Varys said pleasantly. Think out loud. He moved from the door slightly enough to be more present in the space. The appointment is not entirely without merit. Not as a cage, which it cannot be, but as a signal. We are telling the city and the noble houses that what she does falls under crown sanction. That makes her actions ours. Her next success is our success. He paused. Her next excess is also ours. I'm aware of that, Cersei said. I raise it because I think it is the reason to consider the offer carefully rather than dismiss it outright. He folded his hands. The alternative to claiming her is allowing her to remain undefined. An undefined force in this city is more dangerous than a defined one, even if the definition is partially fictitious. Tyrion looked at the ceiling. We're discussing how to put a name on something that would find the name amusing. Yes, Varys said. We are. The question is whether finding it amusing is worse than what she currently is. No one spoke for a moment. There is another avenue, Qyburn said. His voice carried the studied neutrality of someone introducing a topic they have been holding back. The question of alliance by blood is not on its surface unreasonable. She is not affiliated with any house. She holds no land, no debt, no obligation. The correct match? No, Esdeath said. Everyone in the room turned. She was standing in the doorway. The door had been closed. Nobody had heard it open. The guard outside had apparently made no sound either, which would require explanation later. She looked at the 4 of them with the mild cataloging expression that had by now been observed by enough people in King's Landing to have acquired a reputation of its own, not hostile, not amused, simply present and assessing in a way that made the assessed feel like subjects of a study rather than participants in a conversation. The door was closed, Cersei said. It was, Esdeath agreed. This meeting was not, I know what the meeting was. She stepped fully into the solar. Nobody moved, which was the right response, and everyone present knew it was the right response. And knowing that they were making the right response for this reason was its own kind of humiliation. I will take the rank, she said. It costs me nothing, and it will be useful when I need Crown's sanction as cover for something I intend to do regardless. She looked at Qyburn. The marriage proposal does not require discussion. Qyburn accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had already considered both outcomes. Understood. The appointment, Cersei said, recovering ground as quickly as she was capable of recovering it, which was quickly. What designation would you accept? Esdeath considered this with the brief attention she gave to things that were settled. Questions dressed in open-ended clothing. Whatever carries the most authority over the city's security. The name is irrelevant. What matters is that it gives me access I don't currently have to the Watch's resources and the Gate's records. Tyrion was very still. He had been watching her since she appeared in the doorway, and he was behind the stillness, conducting a rapid reassessment of several assumptions he had been operating under. The designation she was accepting was not the cage Qyburn had designed it to be. It was the key she needed for something she had already planned. You came here knowing what we'd offer, he said. She looked at him. You moved predictably. We moved as anyone in our position would move. Yes, she said. That's what I said. Cersei's hands were very still in her lap, which was a sign Tyrion knew that she was containing something. You will operate under Crown authority, she said. That means reporting to no. Esdeath said for the second time, the same tone, the same flatness. I will operate in this city. The Crown will be informed of what I choose to share. That is the arrangement. She looked at Cersei directly for the first time since entering the solar, a long, level look that contained no aggression and no deference, and somehow managed to be more unsettling than either. You are trying to define what I am by what you give me. It won't work. But the appointment serves a purpose for both of us, so I'll take it. On those terms. The space held. Cersei said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to become a decision rather than a pause. Then she said, the designation will be formalized by the end of the week. Good. Esdeath turned and left, pulling the door closed behind her, with the same quiet it had made when it opened, which nobody could explain. The assassination attempt came 3 nights later. It was not ordered by Cersei. Tyrion was fairly certain of this, not because Cersei lacked the inclination, but because the execution was too clumsy for her, and because the timing 3 days after formally granting a title would have undermined the posture she had spent those 3 days constructing. Someone else had decided not to wait. The 3 men who went into the outer ring of the Red Keep that night were not amateurs. They had been selected by someone who understood that ordinary cutthroats did not apply for this work, that the target was not ordinary, and that the only viable approach was speed and simultaneous action from multiple angles. They had good information about her quarters, the private entrance, the secondary yard, the fact that she kept no guards outside her door. They had a substance in a sealed vial that Qyburn would later identify as a compound that induced rapid cardiac arrest when introduced to the bloodstream, effective at concentrations too small to taste. They had a plan. It was not a bad plan. What the plan did not account for could not account for. Because no plan in Westeros had ever needed to account for it, was that the temperature inside her quarters dropped to a point that human physiology cannot sustain at approximately the same moment the first man crossed the threshold, and that this drop was not gradual. 2 of the 3 were found at the entrance to the secondary yard the following morning. Standing, upright, with the expressions of men who had been in the middle of completing a task and had been removed from the process of completing it so quickly that their faces had not received the news. The 3rd was not found in the yard. He was found sitting against the wall of the main corridor, alive and unharmed and apparently incapable of speaking, which condition persisted for 4 days before resolving. When he could speak again, he was able to confirm that the woman had been awake when they entered, that she had been standing at the window as though she had been waiting, and that she had said one thing to him before he lost the ability to track subsequent events. He remembered it very clearly. She had said, "Tell whoever sent you that I left one alive on purpose." Tyrion read this account, closed the page, and sat with it for a long time. Then he went to find Varys. "It wasn't Cersei," Tyrion said. "No," Varys agreed. "I believe it was a consortium of 3 minor lords who concluded collectively that the threat she represents outweighs the benefit of her continued presence. They are not wrong in their assessment. They were simply wrong about their capacity to act on it. Who specifically? I am still establishing which of the 3 provided the compound. That is the thread worth following. Whoever has access to that specific formulation has access to Qyburn's research, which narrows the field considerably." Tyrion absorbed that. She left one alive. She did. Because she wanted a message delivered. Or, Varys said, because she wanted us to know she could count them, track them, and choose her response. 3 men enter her room and exactly 1 leaves with his life. That is not accident. That is instruction. He paused. She is telling whoever ordered the attempt that she knows how many there are. She is telling them she will decide how many there are afterward. Another pause, quieter. And she is telling us that she knew about the attempt before it happened and chose to let it arrive rather than prevent it. Because a prevented attempt proves nothing. A failed attempt, handled exactly this way, proves a great deal. Tyrion looked at his cup and did not drink from it. "We gave her an appointment 3 days ago," he said. "She accepted it to get access to the gate records and watch resources. Within 3 days, she had identified an assassination plot, allowed it to proceed, neutralized it with surgical precision, and sent a message that will reach every minor lord who was considering similar action." He set the cup down. "Tell me what I'm missing." "You're not missing anything," Varys said. "You're simply watching someone who is better at this than we are operate inside our capital." "Better at what?" "At understanding which demonstrations matter." Varys's voice had an unusual quality to it, not quite admiration, not quite fear, the specific register of someone who recognizes skill from very close range and is unsure how to feel about the recognition. "We gave her a designation and thought we were containing her. She took it as a tool. Someone tried to kill her, and she turned it into a message. Every action we take to manage the situation becomes material she uses to manage us instead." He folded his hands. "We are not playing the same game. We are playing in the same space. But the game she is playing has different rules." Tyrion was quiet for a long moment. "The lords who ordered the attempt," he said. "What will she do?" "I don't know," Varys said. "Which is, I think, the point. Outside the Tower of the Hand, King's Landing made its night sounds. Somewhere in the outer ring of the Red Keep, in a room with a private entrance and no guards at the door. A woman who had been offered a cage and taken a key stood at her window and looked out at the city that was still in most of the ways that counted, trying to decide what she was. She had a great deal of time. She was not in a hurry. The city, on the other hand, was beginning to understand that it was.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.